So it's always worth Eamon actually getting down into these cab hearings, because not just what you hear in court there, but just what you can sort of divine the extra stories. And as part of a cab case against Paschal Kelly, a very notorious criminal, another name has popped up in some of the documentation around it. A guy called Jonathan Gill, who's featured previously on Crime World. So how did his name come up? It's a case against Paschal Kelly.
Yeah, well, I suppose Paschal Kelly, as we can say, he's a convicted tiger kidnapper.
Yeah.
He's a kind of a veteran gangster, I suppose, would be the terminology we'd use. He sort of originally, I think he's connections with Drumlin and Criminal, but he's also kind of Coolock area as well himself.
I think he was a very major criminal figure, totally in his own right, and I think he was credited as being one of the people to bring tiger kidnapping to Ireland. I think he was at one point regarded as being the first to get into that business, really.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the point we're trying to make is that he's not small time.
No,
I suppose he wouldn't be a regular name anymore. He's serving a 15-year sentence, or sorry, a longer sentence than that, an 18-year sentence for a tiger kidnap robbery, a pretty nasty one, in which a postmistress and I think her daughter and an exchange student who was living in the house were all held at gunpoint, and genuinely thought they were going to die as they were driven around in the dark, waiting for the time safe to be opened so the money could be stolen and got away with. This was a cab case that was against him. It was pretty much an historic one. I think there was what they call kind of Section 3 orders against the property, which they declared the proceeds of crime back in 2016. But the actual investigation would have happened in 2010. And there would have been these affidavits kind of made at the time. So these are the investigating officers would have stated the evidence they have against Paschal Kelly. And in that, they were going into his criminal background. And as part of that, they said that he was... He controlled a serious criminal gang along with Jonathan Gill, and that they were involved in burglaries, they were involved in drug dealing, and I suppose it's the first time that we've kind of heard of Jonathan Gill in these kind of stark terms. Like
the cab cases work, it's obviously not a criminal case; it's a very different sort of procedure, and as part of that, the officers investigating it, they get to give kind of a broad picture of somebody, because they're not trying to prove each step beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's effectively kind of belief evidence. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, and that's what they're actually called. I mean, it would be, I mean, the chief officer, whoever the chief superintendent at the time is, at the moment it's Michael Gubbins, and he'll put in the belief affidavit, and that's the kind of the first affidavit that goes in, and he refers to within those the kind of the grounding affidavits on which he has formed this belief. And this usually investigating guards, it's often people who have been part of, say, a crime task force or a specialist unit, or they've been detective in a particular town or village or whatever, and they were able to give, I mean, the phrase they often use is, that, so-and-so has, 8 previous convictions, but I do not believe this to be a true reflection of their involvement in crime.
Yeah, so they can include stuff like arrests, for example, that if they were to bring a criminal case against somebody, they wouldn't necessarily be able to admit previous arrests that didn't amount to a prosecution. I mean, there could be different circumstances, but... you wouldn't be able to put any of that in front of a jury. Yeah.
I mean, generally, that would be, that would be impossible to get that in front of a jury.
Yeah.
So, we know in this case, like, part of the belief evidence was the number of times Paschal Kelly and Jonathan Gill were together when they were stopped by guards. They were interchanging vehicles. One was driving a particular vehicle one day, and then another day the other person would be driving it, or even in one case, one of them a passenger with the other, and other men who they all believed to be involved in crime. So, I mean, this is all part of their kind of, I suppose, a patchwork quilt that they're building up of, an overarching kind of painting or whole kind of image of, how deeply involved these people are in crime.
Yeah, and see, Paschal Kelly then, in this case, for example, would get the opportunity to give his version of these things if he was to fight the case. In this case, it was, a large amount of money, but still relatively small in the scheme of things.
Yeah, it was just over €20,000,
Yeah.
and it's basically been sitting in an account since before 2016, and it would have been, I think it was to do with a car and some part of a property in Cavan, which were seized and declared the proceeds of crime. And Paschal Kelly said he had no interest in trying to contest this. He was served, I think, in December in Wheatfield Prison.
Yeah.
And it was said in court that, he'd indicated to the guard who was serving him the legal notice that the cab case was coming up, that he had no interest in coming back.
Yeah.
And so, what came out then, I suppose, in the more up-to-date affidavits was the case in point was that there was one car that was declared the proceeds of crime, years ago, and ended up being moved out of the country. And so Jonathan Gill was mentioned then in relation to this as a notice party, and he was directed by the High Court to pay €11,000. And this is all in the affidavits to say that he owed this €11,000. Whether he paid or not isn't stated.
Yeah,
again, as a notice party, he would have been notified, so he could have come to court as well and contested the allegations that were being put before the High Court, which now have been accepted by the High Court, and the case has been settled. Well, it was already essentially settled in the fact that it was Section 3. So this was a Section 4 motion, which meant that was basically to hand over control and have a receiver appointed to the money that's sitting in the bank account.
So Jonathan Gill is named in this affidavit, this belief affidavit, and in which the guards describe an organised crime gang effectively operating in Dublin. Jonathan Gill is named along with Kelly as being, I think, having significant control of something or some term like that of that organised crime gang.
Yeah, this is one section. Like they were described. Gill was described as a close criminal associate of Paschal Kelly, and then there was talk of it. There's a it was put in evidence. There was a 1.3 million haul of cocaine. I think it was 19 kilos of the drug were found at an apartment in Donabate. This is 20 years ago, and that was linked to their gang. And the phrase used was that the drugs captured belonged to the criminal gang over which Paschal Kelly and Jonathan Gill exert substantial control. So, I mean, and this is one of a number of remarks, like throughout a number of different affidavits that, painted the picture of Kelly and Gill being in control of this gang and directing criminal operations.
Now, Jonathan Gill may well say, in fact, I know what he'll say because I did speak to him before. He said when I asked him about him being linked to organised crime, he said, well, prove it. And the context in which I spoke to him was that he had set up a mediation business. It's called Jonathan Gill and Co. Mediation and Negotiations. And he set up this business. He put up a website in which he basically offered his services to resolve disputes that may arise between people outside of the court system. And he sort of says that for example, if there was a marriage breakdown, he says, I've been negotiating and doing mediations for 20 years and always found a simple coffee with a neutral party is more productive than years and years of paperwork and court cases effectively. So, I mean, I rang him up, obviously, because he had been in the papers. He had previously been served with a bill by the Criminal Assets Bureau, I think separate to this, but it may all have been rolled in together. When I asked him about that, he said he did accept that. He said in fact, he said he was launching the business to try and settle that tax bill. He said that he was trying to turn a negative into a positive. Of course, Jonathan Gill had regularly appeared in the papers due to a court case, but a court case ultimately that he was not convicted of. A null prosequi was entered in by the state. That court case was, I think it was 2016, was it?
Yeah,
eventually.
And it was actually a 2011 robbery. No, but the trial, it like everything, like the whole legal process took that long. I think there was a couple of retrials.
Yes.
And eventually the case against him was dropped. I suppose one of the interesting lines is that when there was an initial bail hearing is when, a senior guard just described him as one of the top criminals in the country. And this is, trying to explain why he shouldn't be given bail at the time. But as it went on, the charges were effectively dropped, and not a prosecutor is just when the state withdraws the case against an individual for it can be for any amount of reasons. And so essentially there's no case to answer anymore. So it's not an acquittal because you haven't actually been accused of anything at that stage. So once you get to the point where it's a nolle prosequi, that's, it's even before the case has started. So it's like he was never really brought to trial for that.
No, he was never brought to trial, and the state aren't going to pursue it. And of course that means ultimately that because you're innocent until proven guilty, he is a totally innocent man. Now, he ultimately, it was 2019 when that trial was finished, and then we had another story later about him offering gaming consoles, PS5s at the time, to Temple Street.
Yeah, they was doing his bit for charity. Yeah,
doing his bit for charity. And then more recently, again, he popped up in connection with Martin Foley, actually.
Yeah, that was in 2003. So this is, again, I think it was our colleague Ken Foy in the Irish Independent came up with this one. And there were basically, the two of them were together at locations in the Midlands. There was other men as well. There was kind of a bit of phone footage of the two of them. Yeah. They were there to collect a relatively small debt. I can't remember what it was, but it was, I think the payday for the guys involved would have been a couple of £100 if they had recovered the debt. Yeah. And Jonathan Gill was there with a clipboard. So, it's that kind of level of debt collection. It's not like, it's 100 grand that's, it's owned by a large business or something like that, or a large supplier of some kind. You're talking about kind of relatively small debts, people who owe less than 10,000 or 8,000. And so your percentage on a normal debt collecting agency would be pretty low on that. So, I mean, yeah, so it's a kind of a strange one. We've seen, the Viper, Martin Foley, has been in this business for quite some time, something I know we've talked about before here. Is that you wonder how come it's not really regulated? How can someone like Martin Foley be out there collecting debts and putting himself out there, as debt recovery, who we know one time he teamed up with another person we've written about, Troy Jordan, over the years, would have been part of that. So, I mean, they're not people you want knocking on people's doors. Even if they do owe a couple of grand to somebody, it's a bit...
Yeah, I mean, look, and they're totally acting legitimately. I mean, there is no restrictions on who can be a debt collector, and as far as I know, there's no restrictions on who can be a mediator. Obviously, Jonathan Gill will say, and we've heard him say that he said to me that there's no threats of violence. That's not a part of his work. But he's still calling to doors, and people may feel about that as they want to. Paschal Kelly is obviously he's got a large amount of a sentence still to serve. Is that his dealings with CAB? Because he's had a storied history with the Criminal Assets Bureau over the years.
As far as I know, it is. Yeah. I mean, that was pretty much at the time. He would have been on the run, effectively, all that length of time, and he wouldn't have had much time to build up any more assets, like in that period. So I'm pretty sure that is him wrapped up as regards the Criminal Assets Bureau at this stage, unless they find something somewhere else. But I mean, from what we know of the way he was living before his arrest, that it doesn't look like there is anything left in the piggy bank from him.
No, and of course he was believed to have had a falling out with a number of his associates before he went to prison, that tight connection that he had with a number of gang members, and there are a number of other people named in.
Yeah, there was a good list of the various gang members, and it's interesting enough, two of them are since dead, both killed in gangland murders. Some of them, as far back as 2006, and others more recently, I think in 2014 or something like that. So, I mean, it kind of shows you the kind of the milieu you're in. Like, interestingly enough, there was two kind of, I suppose, historic attempts on Kelly's life that emerged in this as well, something we hadn't heard before. And one of them was where basically there was relatives of his that were, ironically enough, Tiger kidnapped. And when he went to the call to the house in Drimna, a gunman came out and shot at him with a shotgun. He managed to crawl under a car, and he was shot again. He was actually shot in the face, and he survived that. And then while he was being questioned by Gardaí, he mentioned there had been a previous one where he was walking close to Tara Street Dart Station, and a car had driven over him and reversed over him and drove over him again, and a number of men came out with baseball bats and started attacking him, and only for the interventions of passers-by brought that attack to the end. So, like this is this is back in the 90s, I think 98 or something, I think was around the time that this happened. But I suppose it gives you an idea of where some of these guys are coming from.
Yeah. Well, look, a very interesting case, Eamon. And it's a great insight that can be gotten out of some of the details of these cases, even if that sort of 40,000 or 20,000 sum doesn't seem so significant. It's the backstory is quite incredible. Thanks very much, Eamon.
Always a pleasure, Niall.
Robbie Lawler was out of control.
This is Double Cross, the murder of Robbie Lawler.
It was going to be an all-out war with him in the middle of it.
A Crime World special investigation podcast based on my new book, Web of Betrayal, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.